This is something which puts Putin on the back foot. He's got to worry about whether his people are going to accept this war. And if the war is affecting them, which it is because of the sanctions, then it puts him in a weak position. Doesn't mean he stops the war, but it puts him in a position where he's got an incentive to stop the war because he doesn't want to get thrown out by his own people. Because if he does get thrown out, what happens to him? He goes to jail and he probably dies. And he's a man desperately trying to avoid that consequence. He doesn't want to die. You remember he used to sit at these long, long tables because he was so afraid of even catching a cold or COVID or whatever. He's a paranoid little man who's afraid of dying, and the last thing he wants to do is have people surrounding the Kremlin in massive numbers because of inflation or because of the crashed ruble.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations to you, Sir Bill, Sir William. How should I address you?
I think you could just call me Bill since you've always called me that. But thank you, thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Anyway, Bill, it's lovely to have you here, and many congratulations on your elevation, and also a Knight of St. Michael and St. George. That's a very illustrious order of chivalry.
Well, all I can say is that that there's a lot of brave people out there, in addition to me, who have been fighting Putin. Some of them, some close friends of mine, are now dead. Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov. Many of them have spent time or are currently in prison, and so. However, I'm being honored. This honor is for them even more than it is for me. I dedicate this to them because we're all in an absolutely mortal struggle with an evil dictator.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is clearly an enormous compliment to you personally, but what about then its significance as a statement on top of it being a personal honor? How do you read its significance?
Well, it's interesting because I've been in conflict with Putin and Russia since they killed my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, in 2009. So it's been 15 years. And for a long time, Britain as a country and the government and the establishment welcomed Russian money, and they really didn't want to hear what I had to say. And the fact that there's been this complete U-turn, that the government, the institutions have very, very strongly supported Ukraine, have condemned Putin, and now have brought me into the fold, sort of a warm embrace to my mission, tells you everything, really.
Yeah, again, as you say, a warm embrace, an enormous, pat on the back. Are you, though, equally impressed with the efforts of the British government and the West generally in confronting and trying to deal with Russian corruption, financial corruption, including that which involves the so-called oligarchs?
Well, I think that up until February 2022, Russian oligarchs were welcome in London. I would say more than welcome in London. They were being sort of recruited to come to London with all the best professionals and so on. Since the war started, and since these oligarchs have been put on the sanctions list, I don't think there's any Russian oligarch that feels comfortable in London. But we're still missing a lot of prosecutions. There hasn't been a single major money laundering prosecution again for Russian economic crime in this country since Putin came to power. And this has been the country that has received the most dirty Russian money. So I think that's one place. And then secondly, because the sanctions program really only got going when the war started, the Russians are still running circles around us. They found every possible loophole. They're using those loopholes. And we just don't have that much resource or experience. And so I think as time goes on, we need to get better at figuring out how the Russians are going to cheat us, how they're going to try to cheat sanctions, how they're trying to get money even when we say they can't have their money. And so, for example, it used to be that Rolls-Royce would sell their cars directly into Russia, and of course they can't do that now. But all of a sudden, there's this massive spike in the sales of Rolls-Royces to Azerbaijan. Well, guess where those kind of cars are going? They're going into Russia. And so these are things that we need to fix. We need to close the loopholes. We need to clamp down on it. I think there's a will now in the British government, but I still think that there's a lot of capacity needs to be added if we're going to do this properly.
Okay, more to be done. Now, look, you will have seen headlines in today's Russian media reporting panic in the Russian currency market. Now, that is significantly a consequence of sanctions, especially sanctions on Gazprom Bank, the third biggest bank in Russia, which deals with energy transactions involving the American system. It engages with the American system. It is used to pay the Russian military. Are you celebrating those headlines reporting panic in the Russian financial system?
Well, I mean, what I'm celebrating is that we're finally starting to see the quantitative results of sanctions, and so as you mentioned, there's a crash in the currency. The ruble has gone to 108 to the dollar, which is dramatic. You know, the moment that they went past 100, that's like a sign of real currency weakness. We've also seen interest rates in Russia at 21%, inflation at 28%, the price of potatoes up 60%, and that's the kind of stuff that affects everybody in the country. So for a long time, they could say everything is fine, the economy is doing well, and by the way, this is just what they call the special military operation. It doesn't really affect you. But now everybody is saying, well, wait a second, how does this not affect us when interest rates are 21%, potatoes are 60% more expensive, and I can't afford to buy any imported goods because the ruble is so crashed, so devalued. And so, yes, this is something which puts Putin on the back foot. He's got to worry about whether his people are going to accept this war. And if the war is affecting them, which it is because of the sanctions, then it puts him in a weak position. Doesn't mean he stops the war, but it puts him in a position where he's got an incentive to stop the war because he doesn't want to get thrown out by his own people, because if he does get thrown out, what happens to him? He goes to jail and he probably dies. And he's a man desperately trying to avoid that consequence. He doesn't want to die. You remember he used to sit at these long tables because he was so afraid of even catching a cold or COVID or whatever. He's a paranoid little man who's afraid of dying, and the last thing he wants to do is have people surrounding the Kremlin in massive numbers because of inflation or because of the crashed ruble.
Yeah, I mean, look, the panic in the Russian financial market is largely a consequence of those sanctions, but it is also simply to do with the cost of sustaining the war, the pressure that it's put on shortage of labor, people being sent to the front. It has to do with the additional cost of supplies. It all adds up to inflation and other big problems for the Russian people and the Russian economy. Is it a sign that Russia can no longer carry on with this war as it is going? It just is not sustainable.
Well, that's the hope. The problem is for us is that he might have held on just long enough, because we're in a moment. There's now a new U.S. president coming in, Donald Trump, on January 20th. Donald Trump has basically said he doesn't want to spend any more U.S. money on Ukraine, which means there's a very strong chance that he's going to cut military aid. If he does cut military aid, then Putin all of a sudden gets this enormous advantage. It'll take a few months for it to come through, but all of a sudden, that's kind of his Hail Mary. That's the wild card. That's what Putin has been waiting for, and he's got Donald Trump. And Ukraine, if they do get cut off, then even with all these problems in Russia, they can sort of finish the job that they started 3 years ago, which is tragic for us, for Ukrainians, for the people living in the Baltics, and for Poland. And just for human beings generally who care about freedom and goodness.
I mean, stopping support for Ukraine would obviously be an enormous help to Russia and to Vladimir Putin. Can you feel confident that the new president, Donald Trump, will carry on the pressure of sanctions in the way that Joe Biden has been doing?
Well, I don't have any view. I can't be confident about anything because his only real sort of clear policy statement is a statement where he says that he was going to solve the war 24 hours after he was elected. Well, it's been a lot more than 24 hours since he was elected. He hasn't solved the war. And what does that mean? What is he going to do to solve the war? Is he going to basically create a situation where the Ukrainians have to capitulate? Is he going to do a Neville Chamberlain, here you can have Ukraine to Putin, peace in our time type of thing? I don't know. If he does that, then of course it's going to be a total disaster for us. And by the way, I have a prescription for that eventuality, which is that when the war started, we, the United Kingdom, the European Union, the United States, and other countries froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. And that money is still sitting with us. And most of that money is with us. I think only about $12 billion is with the United States. And so if worse came to worse, and the United States stopped funding Ukraine, stopped military aid for Ukraine, we could confiscate that money. And if we confiscated that money would then fill in for the lack of U.S. money. And that money would then allow for the Ukrainians to finish off the war that we're now seeing Putin suffering from. And so, in my mind, that seems to be the rational thing. Let Putin pay for it. Donald Trump doesn't have to pay for it. Putin can pay for it. And he can pay for the end of the war where he has to fail and capitulate. But we need to act now, and we need to act with our allies. And I see everybody sitting back and sort of scratching their heads. I think that there needs to be a sense of urgency. Because, by the way, if we don't do that, and Ukraine fails, if the front line collapses, you know what's going to happen? As far as we're concerned, we're going to end up in Europe and the United Kingdom with 15 million more Ukrainian refugees. Not to mention the fact that Putin will then start looking at the Baltics, we're NATO allies. And if he goes after the Baltics to test NATO to see whether we're going to reply, and Donald Trump, by the way, doesn't like NATO, we could end up with either war with Russia without America, or even worse, we could end up in a situation where Putin then takes over all of Eastern Europe. And so we have a very strong interest in using the frozen Russian money to supply Ukraine with the money they need to continue fighting this war.
Bill, Sir Bill, good to talk to you. Thank you so much, and enjoy your celebrations this evening.
Thank you.